going to start recording. Yeah.
All good?
Yes.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming along. We'll get started. So basically, the idea of this session was to talk about fellowships. So to go through different fellowship options, to sort of briefly talk about the difference between fellowships and other types of funding options. Silvia is going to sort of go through in more detail some of the main fellowship schemes, and then I'm going to talk about how fellowships are assessed, what to think about when you're writing a fellowship application, what are the top tips to consider, and then feel free, anybody that's got any questions, feel free to stick a hand up or interrupt, or kind of interject, and or if not, then we'll leave some time for questions at the end. But happy to be interrupted if you have anything burning before the end. So let's see whether the slide transition works. Hopefully that's worked okay. So basically, I firstly wanted to talk about the difference between fellowships and other options. Apologies if this is sort of obvious to people, but fellowships are personal awards, so they generally cover the fellow's salary and some research costs. Might also include training costs, might include some research assistant costs, depending on the types of fellowship, but they're for the fellow to conduct their own sort of independent research and to build their sort of research program, and they're competitive. They're very highly sought after because they fund the person's salary. They bring in money to the university. Some of them bring in overheads. Generally, the university is then getting a really good researcher doing some really good research, and they don't have to sort of fork out the costs to enable that. Apart from the sort of supportive environmental type stuff that in space, etc., to support the fellow. But generally, the universities are really keen on people bringing in these personal fellowships, and so they're very competitive, and you have to sort of apply at the right point when you're gonna stand a chance. So fellowships aren't for everybody, and you if you sort of just come to the end of your PhD, there's not actually that many options for the very early stage fellowships, and generally people would undertake some sort of postdoc position or a couple of postdocs positions to get them in the right place, get their sort of publications and their track record up to scratch, so that they'll be competitive for a fellowship. And I guess everybody knows to get a postdoc, you generally need to sort of network with people, so you know what positions are coming up. You apply for them like you would any job, or you sort of get involved in some PI writing a grant where they name you on that application as a named postdoc. And generally, therefore, you're working for that principal investigator on their research, and you've got sort of limited scope to do your own things. But generally, as part of that, and there's a push within the university to allow people, postdocs on grants, to sort of undertake their own personal development, and that might include sort of developing your own research ideas and maybe doing some small pilot work that would help get you in a good place to think about a fellowship. So obviously, some people go straight from postdoc positions into an academic position if you're lucky, but quite often, the people on fellowships are in a really good place to transition into a academic position afterwards. And there's a new sort of faculty wide tenure track process for people on intermediate fellowships now, where if you've got a sort of 5-year plus fellowship, plus that includes some costs for a research assistant to help you start to build a team, then you sort of would be on this sort of academic tenure track where there'll be progress reports and things, and then if you pass all those, you'd be sort of in a good position to get a permanent position through the university afterwards. Not everybody moves on to the academic track. You know, lots of people go from one type of fellowship to another type of fellowship, and often you senior researchers that are on senior fellowships that have been on fellowships the whole way through their career, and then only sort of when that comes to an end, they move into a sort of professor position or something quite senior. The senior fellowships are getting rarer and harder to find nowadays. The Wellcome Trust used to have one, and they're stopping it. But generally, you know, there are opportunities for people that want to do pretty much all research to continue sort of applying for fellowships to continue to do that throughout their career. So fellowship, what we mean by fellowships, are basically, personal awards where you drive the research question, and there are loads of different types that span all the way from your PhD all the way to senior fellowships, as I mentioned. So at the PhD stage, they're generally called research training fellowships or doctoral fellowships, and they're often both clinical and non-clinical options for those. In terms of, you know, the difference between the two, often the non-clinical ones provide a stipend, and it's more difficult for clinical candidates to move off a clinical salary onto a non-clinical stipend. So there are clinical PhDs where they would pay the clinical salary rather than a stipend. And there are various PhD programs as well which offer PhD sort of fellowships within the university, and they're both clinical and non-clinical. We have, for example, an MRC DTP which offers PhDs, but we also have like thematic programs, including through the BHF Centre of Excellence and the Wellcome Trust in areas like regenerative medicine and neuroimmune interactions. Then at the sort of early postdoctoral fellowship stage, these are typically skills-driven fellowships. So they're generally 3-year fellowships where you're developing particular skills that build on your PhD. They are often hosted within an academic's lab, so you're sort of a bit more supported in terms of supervision and things from an academic, even though it is still your own research project. And they typically just fund you and some research costs. They won't fund like research assistants generally, or postdoctoral research associate in your team. So these are the early stage ones, and there are less early stage ones, I think, than there are the next stage, the intermediate career fellowships. So the intermediate ones are sort of generally known as mid-career, I guess, but are for people which have done some postdoctoral research experience. They have already started to establish their independence through, they might have a small grant award or received some funding, and they may have done an early stage postdoctoral fellowship or have done a number of postdoc stints on PI projects. And these are generally sort of 5-year plus fellowships, and they generally allow you to employ a member of staff to sort of start building your team. And then the senior fellowships are for people that are fully established. Those that are already independent but just want to spend all their time doing research. And so generally they're senior people. They would funding to build a bigger group, etc. So the MRC have a really useful skills table to align your skills against these career stages, and I think in this mode in Teams you can click on the links, which is quite cool. I didn't realize until recently that you could do that, so feel free to click on any links in the slides. There are fellowships that are particularly for people that have undertaken a career break, and that generally means for things like caring or illness. It doesn't generally mean for people that have just decided to leave academia to work, for example, in another sector for a while. They're generally for career breaks associated with parenting, caring, or illness. And I think, Silvia will touch on some of these when she goes through her slides. Just to say, for those that are sort of wondering what the difference is between a fellowship and a new investigator research grant, so both of these are aimed at transitioning to independence. But if you're sort of a new lecturer that doesn't already, doesn't have a big research grant, has never had one, and so you're not fully sort of independent as a researcher yet in terms of your research program, you can apply for a first grant as a PI to the research councils under their new investigator research grant scheme. And so the difference between those and a fellowship is that they generally would have a sort of narrower focus, so a project focus rather than a sort of ambitious program of work, generally sort of 3 years rather than 5-year fellowship. And you would generally combine those with other commitments. So they would fund 20, 30, 40 or 50% of your time, but they wouldn't cover 100% of your time. So so if you're applying for one of those, you generally need to think of where the rest of your salary support is going to come from, either doing teaching or whatever it is. And if you're a new lecturer, then those are often useful things to be able to balance teaching and get some support for your sort of first research project. So the next thing to say is that funders have different remits. I know that's a bit of an obvious thing to say, but it's worth really thinking about the remits of the different funders that support fellowships. So obviously the research councils, MRC funds the mechanisms underpinning disease, and that can be all the way from basic health research to proof of concept trials in humans. BBSRC focuses on human physiology, cell biology, genetics, genomics, but where it's relevant to normal human functioning. So not about disease, but about normal functioning. So it could be, for example, healthy aging, but the minute you sort of move into disease, then you are in MRC's remit. NIHR supports health and social care research, and is generally very applied and translational research with pretty direct patient benefit, and so they don't support, for example, animal work. And then the Wellcome Trust has a really broad biomedical research remit, but is generally what they fund is at the fundamental end in terms of discovery science, and they've moving away in terms of their fellowships really from more translational stuff, and all what their fund really is the real breadth of discovery research. So for those of you that might have heard, Wellcome's got 3 priority areas. They do, but those are sort of challenge areas, and their discovery awards are actually available in all areas of discovery science. And then the British Heart Foundation, obviously they support heart and circulatory disease, including the cause, prevention and care. So really think about the remits of the different funders when deciding which to go for. Generally, you can apply for fellowships to multiple funders at the same time, as long as they're not within the same organisation. So, for example, you wouldn't be able to apply for an MRC and BBSRC fellowship at the same time, or UKRI have one. You can't do that because they apply for one of those and the MRC because the research councils are all under UKRI. But generally, you can apply for say an MRC fellowship and a Wellcome Trust fellowship and a BHF fellowship at the same time. So I just wanted to sort of put this slide up to show the different career stages, like according to funder. So MRC, they have at the PhD stage a clinical research training fellowship, and obviously they support non-clinical PhDs through the doctoral training program. In terms of the intermediate stage, they have both at the clinical side, the clinician scientist fellowship, and they have a CDA, a career development award. What the MRC don't have is the early stage non-clinical fellowship. They used to have something called the skills development fellowship, but that's not available anymore. They discontinued that. So there's a bit of a gap in the very early stage fellowships with MRC. And they have a senior clinical fellowship and a senior non-clinical fellowship. And for those that are clinical people that haven't done much research for a while and are at the consultant level, they have something called the CARP scheme, which is for which supports some research time for those clinicians. Then NIHR have a pre-doctoral fellowship, a doctoral research fellowship. Their advanced fellowship basically spans all the way from when you completed your PhD all the way up to sort of reader level, I would say. So it's really broad, and the only one after that is their research professorship, which is for people moving between reader and professor level. They also have these things called DSEs, the Skills Enhancement Awards, but those are only for people that have an NIHR fellowship that need a bit of extra money to transition between things and enhance their skills. In terms of the Wellcome Trust, so they have PhD programs. They have a non-clinical PhD. They have non-clinical PhD programs that I mentioned that King's has 2 of in regen medicine and neuroimmune interactions. They also have clinical PhD programs, which King's is applying for at the moment in various areas, but we don't have one specifically at King's at the moment. We hope to have one in the future. We are partners on other ones, like in, I think, London School of Hygiene, Tropical Medicine, Global Health clinical PhD program funded through the Wellcome Trust. King's is a partner. But yeah, that's a watch this space. So hopefully we'll have a Wellcome clinical PhD program in an area that might hopefully be relevant to cardiovascular soon. And they also have an early career fellowship, a career development fellowship, and a discovery award. These ones are all the new ones that are starting in November. And so these replace the Henry Wellcome, these replace the Henry Dales, and they replace the Investigator Awards. So Silvia, I think, will talk in more detail about them. Then the BHF have like the clinical research training fellowship, the non-clinical PhD. They have the intermediate clinical fellowship, and at the basic science they have both an immediate and an intermediate basic science fellowship, and they have a senior clinical and a senior basic fellowship. And then I've put the UKRI Future Leader Fellowship. So there's been 6 rounds of that, and there should be another round coming soon. There was sort of some text in the government announcement about that there's support for that will continue, so we expect there will be around 7 for that coming in the not too distant future. So yeah, this was just to say that like obviously, you know, the like top line there, fellowships can go all the way through, but often people can move between the things. So you might do you might do an early career fellowship, then get and then an intermediate fellowship, then move into a academic position, and then apply later on for a senior fellowship or something like that. You know, you don't have to just stay on one track or the other. There are lots of different routes and pathways to follow through this. So Silvia, I'll pass over to you to go through some of the schemes in more details, and just let me know when you want me to transition the slides.
Thanks, Grace. So in general, I'm going to introduce what are the schemes from the major funder for cardiovascular around junior, intermediate, and senior fellowship option. In terms of details, don't worry about the content. We will circulate the slide, and this is also recorded. For the junior career fellowship, there are kind of 2 types of fellowship awarded. The first 2 lines refer to what Chris was saying. Is somebody that is a rising star, brilliant PhD student. These fellowships are awarded usually within the immediate completion of the PhD or less than 2 years of being awarded the Viva, and they cover your salary and some research consumable at different extent depending on the funder, and you have them from Wellcome Trust and from BHF. And the duration is usually around the 4 to 5 year mark, but it can be less depending on on the scheme. And both of the scheme encourage spending some time away from the host institution in order to develop your training. In particular, the BHF one suggests up to 1.5 year in a second institution, just to build your CV, your skills, and your knowledge even further. There are other two type of training fellowship that you can apply immediately after your PhD or at the end of the PhD. They come from the BHF and NC3R. These one are specifically to develop further skill that you didn't achieve within the BHF, within your PhD, and to maybe move into cardiovascular if you have focus, for example, on other type of research, or outside cardiovascular, but still within the remit of these two funders. And usually they are shorter term fellowship because they just provide you an occasion to change your, to increase your training and your skills. Next. In terms of career entry fellowship, there are some from MRC, from BHF. Generally, both provide the salary of the person, the consumable, and in case of BHF, one also can provide some support, technical support. Both these schemes are for career break related to parental, so for example, caring can be having maternity break or any kind of responsibility as a carer, and they are within the 4-year period. They are basically give you enough support to get back into academia and restart your your research. But they're still within a host lab, and you slowly are moving to become towards independency. Next. When it comes to intermediate fellowship, what Chris was saying before, the majority of the fellowship is condensed around this area, and the scheme are very similar one to the other. Depending on the remit of depending on your application, one of the funder will be more appropriate to the other. All the funder cover personal salary. All the funder cover research assistant position. Sometimes can be negotiated to be a postdoc, but a little bit more rare. They cover your research expenses, travel costs to go to conference, any equipment, and welcome in the new reiteration as including also PhD fee for the research assistant to do their PhD. And is the only scheme that offers this option. The length is usually up to 5 years with an extension of additional 2 or 3 years. The extension is not available within the MRC Career Development Award, but is combined within the BHF. And the welcome now is up to 8 years, so it is a longer term fellowship compared to the other. Other funders, if you can go to the next one. The offer scheme, as Chris was saying, are the UKRI, which offer a similar type of fellowship up to 7 years. But there is also a shorter scheme coming from the NC3R, which is for experienced postdoc with a cap of 6 years of postdoctoral experience, while all the other funding schemes, they don't really have a cap in terms of when you can apply after your viva, and cover personal salary, but a smaller amount of research consumable or research costs compared to the other funded, up only to 30K. These are all applicable for non-clinical fellow. However, there are also some schemes more up for the clinical fellow. Chris, if you can go to the next one. The schemes are kind of mirroring each other. So MRC, BHF, and Wellcome Trust, they all offer the option to have a more dedicated fellowship for clinical people. And they do offer the same type of support. So your personal salary, your array, some consumable travel costs, and they also cover 2 clinical sessions per week to continue your clinical duties. And the length is exactly the same as for the non-clinical one. If you can go to the next one. And instead of the NC3R, is the NIHR instead with the advanced fellowship offer a better fit scheme for clinical people. The fellowship tend to be between 2 to 5 years, and they do cover all the various support that you might need to perform your research. When it gets past the the intermediate fellowship stage, the number of senior lectureship are less for both clinical and non-clinical. Chris, if you can go to the next one. So there are basically two schemes that I could find, both from MRC, that are applicable for clinical and non-clinical people. And they offer you some component of your salary, some research cost, staff cost to support your research, and some equipment. The MRC only cover 50% of your personal salary, while while the BHF cover full 100% of your personal salary for the first 5 years, and only 50% if you renew it for a further 5 years. But they give you enough kind of support in order to establish to continue your program of research throughout. And you can see, if you can move to the next slide, these schemes are exactly mirrored for the clinical people, with the addition of some PA time to continue your clinical work.
Thanks very much, Silvia. I want to now just talk about applying for a fellowship and what to think about. Just to say, to start off with, that for those of you who don't know, King's has a subscription to Research Professional, which is a big database of funding opportunities. So that's for one of the reasons, for example, why we don't keep a big database or spreadsheet of fellowship opportunities, because you can go onto Research Professional and type in fellowships as a category, and it will pull up all the fellowships that are available, and you can add keywords like cardiovascular and filter down, etc. So I'd sort of recommend using that, because it often pulls up some of the non-main fellowships from smaller charities or from overseas funders, which we don't necessarily keep a track on, but which might provide useful opportunities for people. So just talking about how fellowships are assessed, they're assessed by the 3 Ps, which is the person, project, and place. So in terms of the person, what they're looking for is the right candidate. So often, that's involves having a really good CV and track record. What funders are increasingly looking at now is more than just the traditional markers of esteem, like publications and grants, but a number of them are introducing things called like researcher resume, etc., where you can detail more about how you contributed to positive research culture, and the panel sort of takes those things into account as well. And obviously lots of funders have signed up to things like DORA, which is about not just looking for nature papers and science papers, but actually looking at the quality of the research in whatever journal it's found. But in general, you need to have a good CV. You need to have some markers of esteem, that you're, showing that you're making your presence known in your field, invited lectures, prizes, awards, etc., etc. These are all good things. Often, obviously, at the intermediate stage, if you're applying for funding for a member of like research assistants to build your team, any indicators of previous supervision of PhD students, master students, postdocs, etc. Those are all good things to show that you're the right person for the job. So they're looking for a person that's well equipped and capable of carrying out a really good project. So in terms of the project, what they look for is a high quality project that's novel and achievable in the time frame. So you really have to look at what the duration of the fellowship is that you're applying for. And so one of the pitfalls that I see sometimes people falling into is that they, for example, use exactly the same fellowship project for a 3-year application as for a 5-year one, and there's quite a big difference in time between the two, and these things get picked up by reviewers, whether it's something which is achievable in the amount of time you have available. For some fellowships that are really long duration, like some of the intermediate and senior ones, when they're 5, 6, 7, 8 years long, what they generally look for is a detailed plan for the first few years, and then less detail in the later years. So particularly when there's a fellowship like UKRI FLF, where it's a sort of 4+3, they look for a detailed plan for the first 4 years, and then a general idea of what you might do in the subsequent 3 years. But they want to know that you have a plan for what you would do in that time frame. It has to answer an important research question, and specifically it has to be able to answer the research question. So you have to have some hypotheses which are actually testable with the methods that you're proposing. Quite often that's what falls down in terms of the project, is that sounds like a really interesting question, but actually what you're doing, you're not going to get an answer. You might contribute information and knowledge to that answer. And if that's the case, if that's what you're aiming to do, then you need to say that and not overclaim. You're going to be able to answer a question when you're not. And the project has to be something which is achievable and can be carried out in the right place. So that's the third P, which is about the environment. And so applying to conduct the project in the right research environment. Often, with fellowships, as Silvia mentioned, there's the opportunity to do sort of some work in another lab or in a sort of other setting as part of that, and that can be really good, particularly if you're staying in the same institution as you did your postdoc or PhD. It's really important to get that additional experience. Some funders really look for people to move, others are less bothered by it, and as long as you can convince that it's the right place to do the research, then generally it should be fine. But you really have to think about the question of independence, because fellowships are all about developing independence. So even if you're applying to do the fellowship in what you think is exactly the right place, but you're going to be working really closely with the supervisor that you did your postdoc under, and you would be planning to publish papers with that person, and you would still be like first author and they would be senior author, then that's not going to help you develop your independence. So you really have to think about that question, like how are you actually going to become senior researcher on that particular project and be able to publish as such, etc. And that's what funders and the panels are really looking for, is that establishment of independence, and the place is really important for you to be able to establish that independence. Obviously the facilities and resources are really important. You need to be somewhere where you have access to the right stuff, but if you don't have access to something particular in the place that you're at, you can collaborate with others that have it, and include letters of support from them where they're providing something that you would need. And often people forget to include letters of support where they have collaborators that are providing something, and then that creates a doubt in the reviewer's mind about whether you have everything you need. So for example, if your project involves accessing some data, being able to show through a letter of support or something like that you definitely have access to that data, that's really important. So having the right co-applicants and collaborators on board is really useful. Co-applicants, I guess, should mean like sponsor or something like that, because generally you wouldn't have a co-investigator, you would have a sponsor that might like be more of a mentor, and the collaborators will be people which are actually helping you with the research. Okay, so thinking more about a successful fellowship. So if you're applying for a fellowship, you need to think about the supervisor and mentor. Ideally, they should have a track record in supporting early career researchers, because generally there'll be a section of the application form where they have to detail their track record in that regard, like who they've mentored, like what they've gone on to do, how they'll be supporting you, etc. So having somebody that's experienced with that A, is really valuable for you and your career development in your project, but B, is something which is on the application form that reviewers will be looking at. You also need to have a strong collection of collaborators that can support you in the work, which I just mentioned. You really need to think about training and development needs during the fellowship. So although the early career fellowships are sort of focused on skills development and training, the intermediate ones also, there often is a key component about training and development. So that might be particular technical skills. It might involve going and spending time in another lab that has a particular technique that you could learn and apply. Or it might be more things like leadership development at the intermediate stage. Like if you haven't really grown your group, then some training on building a team, like managing your staff, etc. Those might be really important aspects of your training plan. As I say, particularly for the postdoctoral early career fellowships, but also the intermediate fellowships, really important to think about the independence question. And then you need to think about your longer term career plan and the long-term vision, because that's also something which panels are looking for. They're looking to invest in people as well as the project. So if your project's quite narrow, you kind of have to really convey what the long-term vision is, how it fits into your plan going forwards. And every academic really has a unique selling point. When you think about, senior academics, they're known for something. They're known for a particular area where they specialize in, and you really need to think about what helps to differentiate you and what you can claim as your USP in a fellowship application. Quite often, one of the things that people fall down on in fellowship applications, they apply in an area where there's massive amounts of competition, and there are senior people working in the UK or overseas that have made really big strides in the area, and it's hard then for a reviewer and a panel to know what actually you're going to add to the field, what's going to be, what are you going to do that's any different to them. So you have to think about what your USP is and how it will be, how it will help to differentiate you. And then often the other thing to really think about is, can you convey whether it fits in with any other larger or strategic initiatives within the university? If, for example, it takes advantage of a particular really useful data set that's unique to King's or unique to the place where you're holding the fellowship, then you can convey how it's a really good fit with the university, and particularly for the intermediate fellowships, because King's would be committing to sort of your long-term career development and long-term support on the sort of academic tenure track process. You really need to be able to convey how that fits in with the with the wider work within the department or the school or the faculty where you're based. Common pitfalls are around the lack of novelty or incremental nature of the research. So if you've just finished your PhD and you're proposing something which is just reanalyzing data from your PhD, then it's probably too incremental. But if you can say, I've done this during my PhD, this gives me the pilot data that I can then use to take this forward and take this in a significant step forwards, then that would be okay. So you have to think about how you frame it so it doesn't come across as novel, so it doesn't come across as not novel or incremental. The other thing, obviously, is how it's written. So what might be obvious to you is probably not obvious to people outside of your immediate field. Fellowship panels are generally quite broad in terms of the subject specialisms of people that are reading it, depending on the funder, obviously. But I mean, and there are often sub panels with different expertise. But generally, you have to be sort of put yourself in the shoes of a reviewer and think like, if I didn't know like the background to this, would this make sense? So kind of write it like a story that would make sense to somebody that doesn't know the field extremely well. And then on the flip side of that, you need to provide sufficient detail, and that is really to counter any potential criticisms that you might get from a reviewer who does know the field well and would be really interested in the exact methodology that you're using, or like a reviewer which is slightly in your area, thinks they know everything about it, and like wonders why you're using a particular methodology that they might use, and you might think, well, it's obvious why I'm not using that methodology, but you have to be able to really explain that to people that want to know the detail. The preliminary data is an important thing to be able to show the feasibility, and that can be published data. It can be like key things from any recent publications that you've had, and obviously if you've published, then you can show really good track record in the area. Or it can be unpublished, kind of new data that you've got. As long as you also still have published in the area, it's really good to show any new exciting preliminary data that supports your hypothesis. So both published or unpublished prelim data are absolutely fine to include in these things, and often you get additional kind of space to add graphs and that sort of stuff. Insufficient skill sets or not independent enough. So really by this I mean like it has to be something which you are strong in. So sometimes I see, for example, somebody proposing a fellowship that's based on artificial intelligence, but they're not a specialist in AI. They're just applying AI, and it's something which is often gets picked up on, and you really have to show that you're the right person. You have the skill sets to be able to do that research, and that you're going to be able to do it independently without really relying on collaborators. It's fine to have collaborators, but you don't want to just like parcel off different bits of the fellowship project to other people to do. You have to be able to do pretty much all of it with the support of those collaborators, and if you're applying for staff, you have to be able to supervise people that you're getting to do the work. Even if they bring some slightly different skills, you have to know enough and be able to show that you're skilled enough to be able to manage that project. Too ambitious or not ambitious enough is what I sort of talked about before in terms of the time frame. And in terms of a fellowship, often what is useful is having a mix of stuff which I guess are like bankers, things that are going to work, things that are still pretty cool, but actually pretty solid, and a few really ambitious things that are maybe based on brand new methodology that you might have a little bit of prelim data, but you're not 100% sure it's going to work, and then you just have some sort of mitigation plans for what you would do if that bit of work doesn't work out. And then aligned to that, you need to sort of have your objectives that are kind of independent of each other in terms of success. So they all have to relate to the overall aim of the fellowship and answer kind of specific hypothesis or research questions. But you don't want like objectives 2 and 3 to be dependent on objective 1, so that if that fails, then after year 1 of the fellowship, then you can't carry on. And then the final thing really is like the who cares type question. It might be so niche an area that it's quite an interesting science question, but actually like what really is it going to be good for? Like if, for example, you're looking at a particular like pathway or gene, like you have to be able to say that is a really important pathway or gene in the condition that you're looking at. It's no good just saying this is one of like pathways or things that might be important in this. You have to be able to convince that actually this is the critical pathway to be looking at in terms of that condition. And then resourcing, justifying the cost. Often that's just a case of thinking through, like if you're asking for like a team member, what are they going to be doing? What are you going to be doing? If you're asking for some computational resource, but then your like letter of support says, oh, Kings have access to all like HPCs, then you have to think about like what you're asking for and what's needed. But in general, fellowships can be quite large in terms of size, and so if it's a scheme which allows you to apply for 5 years of funding and a research assistant, then you should go for it. There's no point for a 5-year scheme asking for like 3 years of funding. Doesn't make sense. I mean, maybe for some of the long 7-8 year ones you can apply for 5, but generally you shouldn't be asking for a lot less time than what they offer. And then the final thing is, the fact that there's like quite low success rates overall. So as I say, you can apply for multiple fellowships at the same time to increase your chances. Sometimes a good idea to stagger them a bit, because you should usually get feedback from one which would be really useful to inform another, and if you basically sort of fall into a pitfall on one and don't have a chance to correct it for another, you've sort of lost the benefit of it. But don't sort of apply for something, then wait all the way for a year and a bit before you apply for the next one, because you'll just run out of time and you won't have any support for your salary. Make sure that you get peer review from academics that are experienced with that funder. There are loads of academics that sit on funding panels, particularly fellowship panels. So make sure that you get that looked at and get comments. And myself and Silvia can provide comments on fellowships as well. So do send over to us ideas, plans, drafts, and we can provide comments. And if you're lucky enough to get through to interview, we provide mock interviews as well. So yeah, to treat all parts of the application seriously. Particularly if you're applying for a fellowship which has like the NIHR Advanced Fellowship or the BHF Fellowship, where there's going to be like a PPI person on the review panel, make sure that you kind of address those things and treat those things seriously as well. And yeah, in terms of resources to support you, there's BHF Centre, obviously with Silvia and the academics through that to provide peer review. The Research Design Service, particularly useful for NIHR applications, but they also offer comment and critical review of applications to other funders, including MRC, etc. The Research Strategy and Development Team, that's me. And I have a couple of other colleagues in particular areas that I can draw on if it's slightly outside of my knowledge area. The Centre for Research Staff Development also do some various grant writing courses, and obviously they offer the leadership and skills training courses you might want to build into your training plan as part of a fellowship. Then we have a successful application bank. We have we have a health schools one. The IPPN also have one which you can get access to if there's something that specifically like we don't have in ours. So you can download applications and see what the kind of format of them is like, and see examples of what they look like. So yeah, basically talk to experienced academics, and also talk to each other, talk to your peers, because chances are somebody's like had a similar question and has found out the answer, and then it's just really useful to share that information between yourselves. That's just a screenshot of the application bank, so you can see there's lots of different types of fellowships. We've sort of got typically one of each type of scheme in there. And then I just wanted to finish off with a couple of case studies. So as an example of a basic science fellowship award holder, Matt Stroud is a really good case study. He did his PhD in 2010 in Manchester. Then he did a postdoc position, still at Manchester, before he went overseas to the University of California to undertake a postdoctoral research fellowship there, and whilst he was there, he co-wrote some NIH grants, and sort of co-applicant on those, which was really useful for his CV and his experience. And then he came back to the UK as a BHF Centre of Excellence Research Career Development Fellow, which gave him a couple of years of support to be able to write his intermediate fellowship. And then in 2017, so 7 years after his PhD, he was successful in getting his BHF Intermediate Basic Science Fellowship. I'm sure he won't mind me saying, but he also tried a couple of others like the Wellcome Trust and which weren't successful. So again, goes to show, try a few, don't put all your eggs in one basket, because you might be lucky with one and not another. And then a case study on the clinical side, Steve Williams is a really good example, I think. Did his foundation years training in 2007, and then did his and then got a sort of ACF, an OHR ACF, to do his specialist training initial years. Then got a sort of clinical research fellowship to give him some research time alongside his clinical work. He finished his PhD in 2015, and so as a sort of new clinical lecturer, he applied for Academy of Medical Sciences clinical starter grant for new clinical lecturers. Got that, which I think was about 30k. He applied for a Mellows Medal, which was like a King's Prize fellowship, which also gave him a bit of research time and a bit of research costs. And then in 2018, he applied for another one of the internal schemes, the KHP R&D Challenge Fund, to get 1 year's worth of funding to do a translational research project. And he also got a BHF project grant in 2019. And those two things really strengthened and supported his CV, so that when he applied for a BHF Intermediate Clinical Research Fellowship in 2020, he was really in a good place to apply, and he was successful in securing one of these. And that's it. That's everything that I wanted to cover. So I think we still have some time for questions, right?
Yes, thanks, Chris. If anybody has a question, please raise your hand or write it in the chat. I'm gonna stop recording.